for coming. Those of you who know me know that children's rights issues are very near and dear to my heart. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of statute of limitations on child sex abuse. Iowa is one of the worst states in the country in terms of protecting our children. We actually do a better job of protecting perpetrators, and so I'm very happy to have two of the nation's leading experts in how to prevent child sex abuse and what our state can do through lawmaking and advocacy to better protect Iowa's children. And I would love to introduce Marci Hamilton, the Executive Director of Child USA, and Catherine Robb, who heads up Child US Advocacy. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Senator Peterson, and the Interfaith Alliance for putting together this opportunity. Let me just begin by saying Catherine Robb and I met 13 years ago working in the state of New York to get justice for child sex abuse victims. I started in New York 16 years ago, and it took us 16 years in combined effort, 13 years to get justice for the victims in New York. So New York started the tidal wave, and we have seen massive change across the country in the last 2 years. You should have this handout, which talks about what happened in 2019 and what's happening in 2020. I'll get to that. I just wanted to make sure you had a copy before we got started. So the statute of limitations is a topic that is just procedural. It is not something I ever intended to focus on. I clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. I was editor-in-chief at the Law Review of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I was going on to do very fancy constitutional law. And what happened is I learned, as part of doing the First Amendment defenses for child sex abuse victims in the clergy cases, that most victims can't even go to court across the United States. 20 years ago, the vast majority just weren't allowed in court because they hadn't come forward yet. And so I started working on this issue. I thought it was such a no-brainer. I wrote a book called Justice Denied, and really the idea of the book was to write a book everybody could read in an hour, and then I would go on and do fancy constitutional law. And I thought it was a no-brainer. Children being sexually abused, not getting justice, that seems to me like a nonpartisan, bipartisan, no-brainer. Let's just fix it. We didn't understand what we were doing. Let's just fix the law. But as I've learned, and as I've just become more stubborn about over the years, there are forces in our society that fight child sex abuse victims. So that's really the story of statute of limitations reform, and I'm going to tell you about the facts that justify it, why we work so hard on it at Child USA, and why it is so important to be working on these issues. About a third of child sex abuse victims are victimized by direct family relatives. Catherine Robb is a survivor of family abuse. It is the last frontier. It's the one we aren't yet truly talking about. We're talking about the churches and the Boy Scouts and the schools and the coaches and the United States Olympic Committee. But this is a problem that runs across the entire culture. And so if we don't do something now, you can be certain that the children in the state of Iowa are being abused. So let me just quickly say that we're the only organization that tracks this issue across the 50 states. We update our data every week, and we're very fortunate to, Catherine can go to the next one. We're very fortunate to be funded by the McElnail family. The McElnail family, their son was the only person in statute to prosecute a priest who's been sexually abusing children for 30 years in Philadelphia. And the stress of the legal process and being the only one, he relapsed and died of a heroin overdose. immediately before the arraignment. This priest was never prosecuted. So this is all about how do we get justice and when do we get justice. So a statute of limitations is just a deadline. It's just housekeeping in the courts, and it's for two reasons: either to prosecute, so your district attorneys, attorneys general, the FBI with the Department of Justice, or it's about civil lawsuits, and I'm going to talk about both of those fronts in the United States right now. It's just a fact that the criminal statute of limitations reform has been moving very quickly. At this point, 44 jurisdictions in the United States have no criminal statute of limitations. There's no limit for the victims. And so what that means is in those states, the victims get to come forward when they're ready, psychologically and otherwise. And in Iowa, this is one of the last holdouts to have an age cap on bringing child sex abuse statutes of limitations reform. And if you don't have a statute of limitations, you find out about perpetrators you didn't know about. If you do, the secrets stay hidden, and I'll explain that. The other possibility is civil statute of limitations reform. That's for lawsuits. Why do we need lawsuits? Because it's the only way any victim ever gets discovery. That makes it possible to educate the public on abuse in institutions and abuse in families. Without the weapon of being able to go into court, the secrets are kept. And if the secrets are kept, the perpetrators just simply keep operating. That's just a fact of life. So the reality is that the best science, and what we do at Child USA, is put the best social science with the best legal analysis for solving society's problems for children. And we know, as a matter of fact, that age 52 is the average age for someone to come forward who was a child sexual abuse victim. 52. A third come forward as children, though they don't necessarily tell adults. A third come forward as adults, and a third never come forward. So we have this huge amount, we have an iceberg of information about child predators in the United States, and it's been these laws that have kept those secrets just locked up. And if you don't create justice for the victims, essentially what you end up with is the Me Too movement, and then you're laughing at the victim. So what the Me Too movement has been saying is, you should tell your story. It's important to tell your story. Well, it is important for the survivors to tell their stories, but if you tell your story, but the next thing that is said to you is, sorry, there's no justice for you. Thanks for telling us, you can go home now and go live your life. It's unfair. It's so unfair to do that to victims. So we're working hard to try to be able to expand actual justice for the victims, which will then shift the balance of power from perpetrators and the institutions who aid them, and shift the power to the victims so that they can help prevent abuse. It's all about protecting victims to prevent abuse of other children. It's a public policy. Victims delay reporting because of the trauma. We know, as a matter of science, the trauma can result in PTSD, substance abuse, suicide ideation, and of course a higher incidence of suicide, substance abuse, all of these problems that then turn into barriers to disclosure. The person is suffering with their own issues. The last thing they're capable of doing is coming forward to others. So part of what we're dealing with is a massive cost to society of survivors being told, you have to be silent, you have no right to justice, and that just perpetuates the problems that they suffer from. So why do we work so hard on this issue? I've been working on it for 20 years, as I said. It's for three reasons. One, this is the only tried and true means we know to to identify who the child perpetrators are in a state. And here's a good example so you can understand what the dynamic is. If someone comes forward and says they were sexually abused by this adult, and they're not in court, that adult can sue them for defamation. Many times that happens. But if you're in court, you can prove up your case, and they can try to sue you for defamation, but they're not going to get anywhere. If you're out of court, you're going to be silenced because of fear of a defamation lawsuit. Who's the most recent person to file a defamation lawsuit? Well, the most recent is a priest in the Midwest. The most famous is Bill Cosby, who sued, victims number 34 through 50 for defamation and then ended up being convicted criminally, and that case had to be dismissed. So what we're talking about is fundamentally empowering the victims to bring justice to help us identify who the perpetrators are. The second reason we work on SOL reform, as we call it, and SOL is intended to be a double entendre. The reason we work on this is because right now, victims and their families bear the cost of the abuse. Through statute of limitations reform, through the civil lawsuits, the victims shift the cost from their shoulders to the ones who caused it. So a woman in New York who has what we now call a window, she has an open opportunity right now to sue the very first verdict to come down in the state of New York. She's suing her father. She sued her father because of nonstop sexual abuse as a child. Her father's a millionaire. Her father responded to the lawsuit by saying, "You'll get your money when I die." The lawyers responded and said, "You can't respond to a lawsuit like that. You just defaulted. We're not going to go to trial for the damages." And the jury delivered a verdict of $14 million. That would have never happened to that woman, but for the law saying she had the ability to go to court. And he now has to share his vast wealth with the woman whose childhood he destroyed, because the courts are going to make him do it. He certainly wasn't going to do it before that. But finally, the other thing that Child USA is most invested in is educating the public. The public does not understand the prevalence, the constancy of child sex abuse. It's 1 in 4 girls. It's 1 in 6 boys. So in the state of Iowa, 20 to 25% were sexually abused. So anytime you're in a room, the odds are that there is someone in that room who was abused and has not disclosed. The odds are there's someone in that room who was abused and is suffering, but doesn't know what to do about it and doesn't have the power to do anything about it. And so this is in many ways a revolutionary approach of leveling the playing field between those who were victimized when they couldn't protect themselves and the ones who hurt them. It's really just old-fashioned American justice. It's really not terribly complicated. It's nothing like that fancy constitutional law work I was going to do loads many years ago. Last year was a banner year. 2019 was absolutely remarkable. We had never seen a year with this much activity on this front. Most years there would be 1 or 2 states that would do something, 14 or 15 states that might introduce something mediocre or not so great. Last year we had 9 states extended their criminal statute of limitations, including Iowa, but it was a pretty measly 5 years with all due respect. Still pretty short, but 12 states eliminated their criminal statute of limitations last year. 15 extended their civil. 1 state, Vermont, eliminated its civil statute of limitations, and windows were enacted in 9 states. So what is a window? Right. Here's the issue. For the kids being abused today, right now, which they are, if you extend or eliminate the criminal and civil statutes of limitations, you're helping them. And they'll just have longer than they would have had the day they were born. What do you do about the victims whose claims have been shut down because of unfairly short statutes of limitations? And the answer is you revive their expired civil statutes of limitations. So you create an opportunity, and it's state to state. Some states have given 1 year, that's what New York did. So from August 14th, 2019 to August 14th, 2020, any person who was sexually abused in that state can sue for the damage done to them. Who have we learned about? We've learned about perpetrators on Broadway. We've learned about a doctor, Archibald, in the Rockefeller University system, who was an endocrinologist for little boys, who brought them in and sexually abused almost all of them. If you start running the numbers, what becomes amazing is the access to children to abuse them that doctors have. A doctor could have 20 to 25,000 patients over the course of a career, right? We all heard about Larry Nassar, right, with USA Gymnastics. But an endocrinologist in Rockefeller University Hospital, at least 3,000 victims so far. And so what do you do about the fact that none of these victims had ever come forward until this law was in place? You do this in other states so you can find out who the abusing individuals are. And here's the killer. Those who sexually abuse children tend to be the people you trust the most. You cannot trust your instincts because they have to persuade you they're trustworthy to get the child alone. They are literally, in the words of the FBI expert Ken Lanning, the nice guy. Overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly someone that the children know. Only 8% are, remember Stranger Danger? Guy in the trench coat that was lurking around the school bus stop. That's 8% of child sex abuse. The rest of it is just someone in the child's orbit. It's the coach, it's the teacher, it's the person that they're getting babysitting from. So we can't possibly trust our instincts. Now, it's not over yet, and in a minute I'll talk about 2020. Here is the signing of the New York Child Victims Act. Yes, I'm on the left there, looking like I can't believe it. 16 years of going to Albany, New York. I should be sainted. That should be nobody's fate. Catherine went for 13 years, and then we heard this year that we may well work on extending that bill, and we're going to go back. But anyway, this picture from New Jersey is fantastic because what this shows you is it takes an army in your state in order to do the right thing for children. In the state of New Jersey, it was 14 years, but what happened in New Jersey is they passed a very innovative bill. The New Jersey bill says that if you're a victim of sexual assault when you were a child or sexual assault when you were an adult, you get justice for 2 years. Everyone who's been sexually assaulted in the state of New Jersey has the capacity. Now, the truth is not everybody comes forward, not everybody wants to, not everybody needs to, not everybody has the same level of damages. But for those who have been seriously damaged, this is a new life for them. And that's how they'll characterize it. This is their new life. This is, all of a sudden society said it wasn't their fault. So New Jersey is one of the most innovative states right now. And I would have told you 12 months ago they weren't going to pass anything. So don't trust me. So the thing that everybody needs to understand is statute of limitations reform is not just about victims. It surely is. It empowers them. It shifts the cost away from them. But it's really about you. it's about your families, it's about your schools, it's about your churches. It's the only way that there's a weapon that can be used to out the truth. And so this is really about public. It's the public's interest. It's not just individual victims who are politically disempowered. So I'm just flashing this up here. 2020 is already busy. It's already January. 2020 is second only to 2019, and it's only January. So we've already been in Indiana, Iowa. We're headed to other states. I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, outside of Chicago. So I'm going back to the Midwest now, apparently. So, which is just fine. So, how do we rank Iowa? One of the things that we do is we rank every state for its statutes of limitations as compared to other states. On the civil statute of limitations, right now, if it was just based on age, 19 for some, you'd be the worst state in the United States all by yourself. You could even unseat Alabama, which is hard to do. But you have what's called a 4-year discovery rule, so a victim, if they discover that the abuse caused current problems, they have 4 years to come forward. That's rarely been used in the state. So you get a slightly, you're right in the middle of mediocre land on the civil, but it's only because you're getting credit for something that isn't really helping a whole lot of victims. On the criminal statute of limitations, you're in the worst category. You are all the way over here with Nevada, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, and Oregon. These are all states that persist in having an age cap for criminal prosecution. So what happens is the average age of coming forward is 52. So let's say that we have a 55-year-old go to the prosecutor and say, I was sexually abused by my coach in my boarding school. All right? The prosecutor says, oh, well, in our state, the limit is 33. So you only missed it by 19 years. And then some of you may be saying, well, why don't you just do for the criminal prosecution what you do for the civil? Right? Why don't you just revive that criminal statute of limitation? You get everybody to be able to prosecute. California tried that, tried both, and the United States Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional to revive a criminal statute of limitations. And so what that means is the only thing you can do for someone whose claims have expired is to pass window legislation that revives their civil claims. But let's say the 52-year-old, the 55-year-old goes in and they're told they're out of statute. Because when they were abused, it was that age, the age before 55, and so they're out of luck. If they go into the prosecutors, and the prosecutors keep the records they need to keep, and the prosecutors see, oh, you're the first, no, wait, there's another one in the system. If the prosecutors start putting the picture together, they can prosecute someone if they can find a victim in statute. And the only way to make sure there's going to be a victim in statute is to eliminate the criminal statute of limitations, and that's why so many states have done it. I mean, we're now over 80% of the country. 90% of the country has now eliminated the criminal statute of limitations. If you bring all of the criminal and civil SOLs in the state of Iowa together, you're better than Ohio. Ohio's really bad. We had a window in Ohio in 2005, and it was going to pass unanimously. I was in Columbus, and the next day we were going to have a major celebration, and this was going to be a big deal. But at midnight, the Catholic bishops went in their robes to meet with lawmakers. And the next morning when we went for the vote, they had removed the part of the bill for the victims from the past and killed it. Nothing has happened since. But this year, they just introduced a 3-year window. So we expect to see movement in every state in the country on this because it's just irrefutable logic. Whose interest is it to not know who your child predators are? And there are two answers to that. It's in the interest of the insurance industries, who ought to be in the business of helping to prevent sex abuse, not silence the victims. And it is the Catholic bishops who are under orders to try to block this kind of legislation. I'm pleased to report both are not doing as well as they used to at killing it. So we're making progress. So I'm asked a lot, why was 2019 the year where everything changed? What happened in 2018, at the end of 2018? And it's three names. It's Epstein, it's trafficking, right? We learned that some of the most powerful men in our culture were engaging in child sex trafficking. It was the Larry Nassar hearings in which the victims testified to him in public, over 150. And it was the grand jury report coming out of Pennsylvania showing that every single diocese in the state of Pennsylvania had engaged in cover-up. Church, sports, the wealthy, and trafficking. Those came together and everybody saw the need to do something. So often the argument against this is, look, they were abused a long time ago. Most of them have just gotten over it. Why do you care about doing something for the victims from the past? And the primary reason you care is because perpetrators will often abuse into their late elderly years, 80, 90, grandfathers, 3 generations, 4 generations. There's no age cap on this. And so if you get someone to come forward when they're 50, they may prevent abuse of another child, believe it or not. That's just statistically true. On average, according to the FBI, child sexual abusers tend to have 100 victims over the course of their lives. And family perpetrators rarely just traumatize one child. It's typically more than one sibling. It's typically the generations. 90% are known to the victims, as I said, over 90%, and so people have a lot of incentives to keep this secret. Your family doesn't want you to upset the apple cart. Families will shut down victims, but then that perpetrator will be out there. So, I'm going the wrong direction. Once a revival window is open, which Senator Peterson's bill does have a revival window in it, you do not see an avalanche of lawsuits. Instead, what you see is a modest number of lawsuits that tell us a lot of information. So when California passed its bill in 2003, over the course of 1 year, we learned about 300 predators that had not been previously identified. People learned about teachers. They learned about Explorer Scouts, which were the LAPD scout group. They learned about doctors. They learned about family members, and only because the window was open. So this is a public benefit that we get, but as I say, it does not cripple the justice system. Far from it. It's quite something that can be handled. And just to stay true, Iowa also has an overly short child sex trafficking statute of limitations. It's 10 years from the event. So, and for most of those victims, the barriers to coming forward are so extraordinary, as you heard with the Epstein victims, that they too need to be included in this kind of civil justice. So, let's say that the state of Iowa does pass a bill, does help the victims from the past, passes a window. What's next? What do you do next? Because the legal system is very stressful. And one of the things that we do is we put together toolkits for the survivors so that they have resources, they understand they're not alone, and we tailor it to the law of the state so they understand if they're even covered in that state. So if you go to our website, childusa.org, we have toolkits, but we also have more data than you will ever want to know on statute of limitations. So let me just say this isn't all me by a long shot. We have a staff attorney who does nothing but statute of limitations, and that's why we update our data every week. We're the only organization that updates it in less than 3-year intervals. And Catherine is our advocacy head, who is the person who primarily goes state to state working on individual bills. So we have an entire team working on this, and we would love to see Iowa step forward from being one of the worst in the country to being one of the best. So thank you very much on this issue.
So it's our practice with Moral Mondays to just open it up to questions and take our turns. And I also asked the folks to talk a little bit about conversion therapy and anti-vaccination, because those are two pieces that you also deal with. So those are kind of fair play also in the conversation if you have questions about those two pieces. But what questions do you have? Carl?
I was just curious, way back when you were giving initial statistics, how do you know some of those percentages, like 33% not reporting? If they're not reporting, how do you know that 33% is reporting?
So scientists have been spending a lot of time on child development statistics and studying trauma. There are now people who are full-time child traumatologists. They tend to be psychiatrists at some of the top institutions. And it's based on surveys of all the studies that are out there. Yeah. So the age 52 study is really the most reliable study. It was 2,000 victims, and it was half church, half non-church, and it came out to be the same numbers.
Marci, maybe
Yeah.
one of the questions about recall of people, do they make the stories up? That's
So Senator Peterson just asked me, what about false claims? So, one of the biggest arguments is that there must be false claims, and you've got to protect the adults from false claims. In every state, to revive expired statutes of limitations for child sex abuse, so every window state, those are states where someone is coming forward 30, 40, 50 years later, right? So if you're ever going to have a false claim, the argument is that's when it would be. We do not have one reported case from a single state of a false claim. Not one. And there are two reasons for that. People don't tend to make up. That Uncle Bob took me every weekend to the Jersey Shore and sexually assaulted me. It's just not the sort of thing that people want to have tagged as on their bio. But the other part of it is that the way the system works, lawyers and prosecutors vet these claims. And they just don't have any interest in false claims. But the real bottom line is what the science tells us is people don't make up child sex abuse. And that's what the trauma studies and what the universities are telling us. So I have been tracking this from the beginning since 2003 in California, because I wanted to see and track how many false claims were there, and there haven't been any, amazingly, wonderfully.
Senator Mathis?
In the state of Iowa, we have a sexual treatment offender program called STOP. It's for middle school boys and high school boys, a 35-bed residential treatment facility, and it is full. It has a waiting list, and the curriculum is that, 100% of the kids that are there have been perpetrated, and then they turn around and perpetrate something else.
Right.
So the curriculum is, it's very slim on how they were a victim, and they spend more time on how they victimized.
Right.
So if we would apply something like that, let's say a 13-year-old perpetrated a 5 or 6-year-old, how long would that extend for juveniles? Would it extend, if we're talking about statute of limitations?
Well, so what we know with the juvenile offenders is that if we get to them with the best treatment before they turn 18, we'll turn almost all of them around. Mm-hmm. If we treat them with the protocols that are known across the United States, we will turn them away from being perpetrators, and typically they have been perpetrated against. If we don't take care of their psychological needs, if we shut them out of the system and are purely penal against them, the result is that they tend to be more likely to abuse later. So there's a real opportunity in the states right now to stop the creation of future perpetrators if, in fact, they are identified, often institutionalized for purposes of getting the treatment they need.
And a lot of critics, this is a second piece, locally in our school district, there was a 15-year-old who was allowed to volunteer in a kindergarten class and perpetrated 2 children there, and it became a large civil trial. He was sent to Eldora, etc. But all the protocols of the school set up about screening volunteers would not have affected that because this 15-year-old did not have a record.
Right.
Nothing indicated that he was, doing that. So what do you suggest in terms of prevention? So we're not seeing this later where those things are concerned, again, with juveniles. Is it true?
It's really a matter of changing the culture from top to bottom. And it is true that often child volunteers are not screened adequately, and they should be. And they need to be screened in a way that is trauma-informed and in a way that will be more likely to get you some answers than otherwise. So we have done a study of all 32 archdioceses' protection policies for children. This is the organization, the institution that has been under attack for so long. They have been sued, they have been forced to get better procedures. We are assessing all of those procedures. I can tell you now they're all over the map. There's no consistency, but we are convening a group of experts next month to determine, looking at that, looking at what the CDC published in 2007, and knowing what we know now, what is the gold standard for prevention for every youth-serving organization. And once we have put that together, we'll be sending it to lawmakers. And we're also going to send it to the insurance industry, because it's my view, it's our view, that insurance industry should do a child protection audit for every youth-serving organization every year, and if they flunk, they don't get insurance. And if you don't get insurance in the United States, you shut down. It's the only way that we wear seatbelts. It's only because of insurance that we wear seatbelts. So we're hoping to turn them from being on the defense to being on the offense for children. And we're hoping that our gold standard list will help them know, yeah, this is what you should be looking for.
Would you include churches and houses of worship in that?
Oh, churches and houses of worship, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And sports.
I have a question. So, is it fair to say that a lot more states have eliminated the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution than for civil lawsuits?
At this point, yes, but the pace is become very fast for both.
Okay. It looks like in last year, a lot of states got rid of the criminal and only one got rid of the civil. Is that, based on the current law, do you have any idea how many have eliminated with criminal versus how many have eliminated it with civil?
So most of the states last year, as opposed to eliminating the civil, extended it to age 55.
But
That's the new standard.
So out of the 50 states, so not just what happened last year, if you don't know, that's fine, but do you know how many states?
No, I do. It's on our homepage, and I'll get you the exact number. It changed last week, so I don't want to be wrong.
I guess it concerns me that, we've seen legislation here to eliminate or greatly increase the statute of limitations in criminal cases, and it is almost, as far as I know, it's been impossible to get much of anything done with civil lawsuits, and to me, that is where I think at least some victims have a better chance of getting justice. Even if you do eliminate it for criminal cases, ultimately, I think going after some of these, again, organizations in their checkbooks where it hurts is ultimately going to bring more justice and more change. That it's fairly easy for some of these organizations. They're never going to be prosecuted criminally.
Right.
And so
Well, I completely agree with everything you're saying, and actually, it's just a fact that if you look at the grand jury report that the Pennsylvania Attorney General did on 6 dioceses, right, 886 pages long, 1,000 victims, 300 perpetrators, I mean, it's just a lot of numbers. But for any one case, it was maybe 2 sentences, right? One lawsuit would yield 10 times that number of pages on the information that that organization had on the cover-up. The only way that we will stop institutions from covering up child sex abuse across the board, whether it's public schools, private schools, sports, churches, the only way it happens is through these civil lawsuits, frankly.
I'm glad that Senator Peterson's bill has that.
It needs
I
it.
certainly support it. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are also willing to support that to the extent that they're willing to support eliminating it with criminal.
Right. I mean, it's really a simple choice in the end. It all boils down to one choice: children or perpetrators. Right now, the state of Ohio's law prefers perpetrators. It protects them, and it has the back of the institutions that cover up for them. And that means children are being abused right now because of the law in the state of Iowa. You can't flip that without civil statute of limitations reform.
Could you speak to the issue of grooming that might convince a young person that it was consensual?
Right, so as a matter of law, a child cannot consent to sex with an adult. It's statutory rape. But the culture has routinely persuaded children in a society that somehow it's the child's fault. And one of the main reasons victims don't come forward is they feel so guilty they made it happen. Right? And so either the perpetrator threatened them or the perpetrator said, this is your fault. This is totally your fault. And so it's just legally impossible, for the child to consent. And so talking about consent of a child is not rational, but that is how perpetrators justify their activities. And that is how institutions, until recently, institutions would say, well, she was extremely attractive, right? She let him come into her house. That doesn't happen so much anymore because the science says it's just ridiculous.
Thank you. Another reason that I've heard from victims that they don't report is because they actually got some pleasure from the abuse.
Right.
And so that adds to their guilt.
Right.
They don't know that, that shouldn't have happened to them.
Right. I mean, physiologically,
Right.
that can happen.
Right.
And they don't have, we have lots of science on this, they don't have the emotional and mental capacity to process it. They have no idea what this was all about.
Right.
Even if they watch the internet, they still don't get what's happened to them.
And the other thing is that for years, decades, this is a pretty new science. We've only been looking at child sexual abuse for a very short time. And we say kids aren't good witnesses because they have imaginations or because they're mad or whatever. We also then turn around and say, well, adults aren't good witnesses because they're suffering from all of the trauma that happened and they're mentally ill now, or they haven't got clear memories.
Right.
So how can we, I've seen this for years, that people blame the victim and say, well, this is a bad witness, and now we don't have any evidence except for her word.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Right. So in reality, what we've found with all the states that have opened up justice for the victims is that there is a lot of corroborating evidence out there that you can find, one, if you get discovery into the institution that knew that this guy was dangerous. Two, a child that loves to play football, and all of a sudden in 7th grade comes home and says, I'm done. A child whose grades tank. A child who can't cope anymore. A child who starts drinking. Those are all ways in which children express the abuse. They don't know how to put it in words. That's how they express the abuse. And so if you go back over that person's life, I guarantee you there will be a story to be told that will corroborate. But the other thing that we have found in every state is if one person stands up, one victim, and this is what happened with Bill Cosby, right? If one victim stands up, the others start lining up, and your corroboration tends to be the 99 other victims that were perpetrated against by this particular individual. So you only have that scenario, he said, she said, when you're not in court, and when you can't get discovery, and when you can't force the defendants to tell the truth. So that is just, it's a fiction that we created to protect adults. We prefer and we protect adults every single day. It's our instinct, and it destroys children.
Representative Smith has in the back.
I wanted to follow up on what Senator Mathis and Representative Anderson talked about a little bit. I had the honor of studying under Jen Hyman, who wrote a very touching book to help children talk about these issues. And in her lecture, I was struck by her comment that the real goal is to prevent children from perpetrating sexual abuse. And it seems to me that all science supports that if we can, children not doing this will prevent this from happening beyond. So my question is, what is your group or other groups doing to promote that kind of training and teaching children?
So we're putting together the standards that should be applied by every institution. And really there's two pathways to ending child sex abuse. One is identifying the current perpetrators that are still out there, and the other one is helping the victims and including the ones who then perpetrate again. Now, not everyone who's sexually abused then does it to someone else. But for children, it does happen. And so we could do such a better job if we would not let these kids linger in incarceration settings with no therapy. We could turn them around and they could be productive members of society.
Laura?
Is there data on that point you just raised about the proportion of offenders who were victims themselves?
Yes, yes.
Is it high? I mean,
It's not a majority. It's significant. So.
What are states doing, if any, even in Iowa, to help young people to identify, to speak up and say, I apologize if you mentioned sort of taking notes on how bad Iowa right now. But what can we be doing in our schools to train young people, our students, our kids to speak up and identify? Maybe not themselves, but even for others that they're seeing.
Oh, so true. Yeah, I mean, so we need to set up educational programs in the schools for parents, for teachers and administration, and for children. It's age appropriate for the age of the child. Now, there has been a movement across the United States. Aaron Marin has been going state to state in arguing for education about sexual abuse in schools. Unfortunately, what's been happening is states have passed Aaron's law and then not funded it. So we have had very little progress on this. So one of the things that we're putting together is a white paper on the need to educate children from the youngest age in sports, in school, at church. If you don't arm them, I mean, they're not born knowing that someone's going to hurt them. If you don't arm them with some understanding and some self-protection, they're not going to be protected. But the same is true with parents. If parents don't understand that a child alone with another adult is at risk, they won't keep that child from being alone. Right? So tutoring sessions should not be alone in the home. Rides home from soccer practice should not be alone in the car. Those are two of the most dangerous places for children there are, if their parents aren't there. So.
If the statute of limitations has happened and someone reports, do they keep track of the perpetrator? Like, what happens to that information?
So, the only way that you can have a public list of sex offenders is if they are criminally convicted, right? So what happens otherwise is they're still under the radar. And unless, so really you end up with, so what's the second best way to keep track of them? It would be through the civil lawsuits if the victims could come forward. But also, law enforcement needs to be encouraged strongly to keep better records on reports from victims that don't turn out to have fruit that time, because someone else may come forward in 10, 15, 20 years, and they'll be able to put it all together. And a lot of it is computerizing databases in the district attorney's offices.
And same across state?
Yes.
Et cetera.
You want me to say something about vaccinations?
Conversion therapy.
Okay. So let me just quickly say something about conversion therapy issues. We are putting together a study of victims of conversion therapy because there hasn't been a lot of science on it. We know pretty universally it hasn't been a great experience. We know all of the medical communities have said stop this, but we want to be able to quantify it. Here's what's happening. States are considering conversion therapy bans. I know that's one of the things on the agenda here in Iowa. Great for kids, but the devil is in the details. Utah just announced last week that it had banned conversion therapy. It did, but this wasn't covered in the papers unless it's done by a member of the clergy.
Right. Right.
The religious exemptions in conversion therapy across the United States have essentially defanged in most circumstances. So one, devil is in the details on that, and if you create the religious loophole, you'll create the mistakes we made with vaccinations, where we created the religious exemptions to vaccination and now are threatening herd immunity, which it's not just that we're threatening the health of children not being vaccinated, although, I mean, I was appalled when the Kentucky governor had a chickenpox party for his kids. I thought, when those kids get shingles,
Yeah.
they should sue him. That's ridiculous. He just exposed them. Forget chickenpox. They now have the latent virus that gets shingles as adults. But anyway, that's my pet peeve. But vaccination, religious exemptions have opened the door to harming pregnant women, the elderly, and children who are ill. All three of those categories. And so what states are increasingly working toward, and we're helping them with the data and the information, is to end the exemptions other than the medical exemption. The religious exemption opens the door for everybody to say, I need an exemption, and for children not to get the vaccinations they need for society.
But I would also add on the conversion therapy piece of it that the clergy were exempted as a compromise.
Oh, yeah.
So the original bill included them.
That's
and
right.
to get it through, it was actually a compromise. So we do not want that to happen. I'll just say that out loud.
How does the separation of church and state and how does that play into the conversion therapy that's done by church pastors or church counselors?
Depends on how the law is written. So they wrote it so that they were exempted.
So before I donned this hat, I'm a religious liberty expert. And the answer is the First Amendment does not defend any religious group against a law that applies to everybody. So if you have a law that applies to everybody across the board, there is no constitutional right for any religious group to avoid that law. And that's true for conversion therapy, it's true for child sex abuse, it's true for everything. So, religious lobbyists don't really want us to know that, but that's just the reality. And so children can be protected from all categories. They don't have to be subjected
Because
to
that's what
religious-based
we've
abuse.
heard. I mean, professional people, social workers, psychologists, have ethical prohibitions against conversion therapy. But churches don't have that, necessarily have that ethical.
They can
It's
teach.
non-denominational.
Right, absolutely.
They can teach and believe anything they want under the First Amendment. What they can't do is do anything they want. And if they harm a child by the infliction of psychological trauma, they can be held up to it.
I just want to add that I think that one of the dangers to watch for on this is the attacks on licensed professionals. Back to what Representative Anderson was saying about if we're licensed, we're bound often by a code of conduct, and we're also required to defend that what we did was the best practice. And so the real danger are the people who do not hold professional licenses.
Right. So true. A danger to children.
Any other questions? Representative Winsor?
Thank you, and thank you for being here. As I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about scenarios in which, on the House side, we might be able to have some skin in the game in regard to this issue. Friday was the filing deadline for any of us to request a bill directly, so I'm thinking about could we attach it to another bill, exactly how we might do that. But I also want to mention that conversion therapy at our forum in Davenport, Scott County, was brought up, and all three of our Republican senators said they would support a ban.